conservatism. So I'm going to pick up the thread here following this development of religion becoming ever more important to the conservative political movement. In turn, Rand became an ever more devoted atheist. At a cocktail party, she met the young Buckley, already a celebrated figure on the right. She was characteristically direct, telling him in her thick Russian accent, "You are too intelligent to believe in God." Or as Buckley paraphrased it, Gott. Buckley was both amused and offended. He sought the advice of other libertarians, including Isabel Patterson, as he pulled together National Review, but Rand became one of his favorite targets. And in fact, this was the beginning of a sort of ongoing feud between Rand and National Review that continued throughout her entire career. And, Buckley had a very low opinion of Rand and viewed her as potentially a threat who would destabilize this religious conservative synthesis he was working on. So she became something, an icon that National Review returned to again and again to keep stressing how flawed and faulty her ideas were. Now, Rand had her clashes with Buckley, as she did with many figures, but it wasn't something she worried about too much because she had other powerful admirers, among them most famously Alan Greenspan. Now, Greenspan was a member of what was called, tongue-in-cheek, the Collective, which was a group of Rand's most dedicated students who gathered around her starting in the early 1950s. At the nucleus of the Collective was a young couple, Barbara Brandon and Nathaniel Brandon, who became her closest friends. And over time, they brought in their relatives, their friends, people they met, giving them the opportunity to meet this famous author. And the Collective would meet in Rand's New York apartment every Saturday night. They would read drafts of her novel in progress. And it really was essential fuel for Rand as she finished Atlas Shrugged. And so Greenspan was there from the very beginning and had a close relationship with Rand, which I'll describe here. Although Rand disliked him at first, Alan Greenspan soon became one of her favorites. At early meetings, he was quiet and somber, earning the nickname The Undertaker from Rand. Heavily influenced by logical positivism, Greenspan was unwilling to accept any absolutes. He became legendary for his confession that he might not actually exist. It couldn't be proved. Hearing that, Rand pounced. And who is making that statement? To Greenspan, it was a deep exchange that shook his beliefs to the core. By many accounts, Rand excelled at the kind of verbal combat that impressed Greenspan. Hiram Hayden, an editor at Random House and later Bobbs Merrill, marveled at Rand's ability to conquer sophisticated New Yorkers in any argument. Quote, "Many are the people who laughed at my description of her dialectical invincibility, only later to try their hands and join me among the corpses on the Randian battlefield." Rand began with the basics, establishing agreement on primary axioms and principles. She came out on top by showing how her opponent's ideas and beliefs contradicted these foundations. This approach was particularly effective on those who prided themselves on logic and consistency, as did Greenspan. He remembered that, quote, "Talking to Rand was like starting a game of chess thinking I was good and then finding myself in checkmate." Greenspan was hooked. So, what Rand taught Greenspan and the other members of the Collective was her philosophy of objectivism. Now, this is a complex, comprehensive, integrated philosophical system. I go into it in the book. I will summarize it here briefly by pointing out four primary tenets. Objectivism holds that there is a knowable objective reality, hence its name. It holds reason as an absolute, man's only guide to knowledge and action. It asserts that selfishness is a virtue, and it argues that laissez-faire capitalism is the most moral and practical social system. Now, Rand had been developing these ideas in conversation with students and peers for years. They really came together and were articulated in Atlas Shrugged, her last novel she would write, her major novel released in 1957. And she weaves the philosophy of objectivism throughout the text. It's both a story and a philosophical primer of sorts. And like all authors, Rand had high hopes for her book when it was released, hopes that were destined to be cruelly dashed. Time magazine asked, quote, "Is it a novel? Is it a nightmare?" Saturday Review wrote that Atlas Shrugged was, quote, "shot through with hatred." National Review, in a famous poison pen review by Whittaker Chambers, slammed it as dictatorial, arrogant, even fascist. So Rand was crushed. This was not the reception she had been waiting for. But in one of those ironies of histories, the harsh critical reception that Atlas Shrugged met actually increased its appeal because it motivated Rand and her best student, Nathaniel Branden, to start promoting the book's ideas on their own. If they weren't going to get a fair hearing from mainstream culture, they would create their own culture. So Rand is actually one of the first figures to do an end run around the mainstream media of her day and try to get her message out in her own venue. And so objectivism would be primarily promoted by the Nathaniel Branden Institute. It tutored thousands of students in cities across the country and even the world in the fundamentals of her philosophy. It worked by tape transcription. So you would sign up for the lecture, you would come to somebody's house, to maybe a meeting like this, and there would be a tape of Nathaniel Branden talking about the lecture, and this you would listen to. Now, if you were in New York, you could go to these live lectures, and occasionally live lectures would be given in major cities. So the Nathaniel Branden's educational efforts were supported by a newsletter, which at its peak had more than 20,000 subscribers. Rand produced a steady stream of nonfiction throughout the 60s, which very much in the pattern of Atlas Shrugged would be excoriated by critics and then immediately hit the bestseller list. And through the Nathaniel Branden Institute, she was really able to create her own world and her own subculture, where people could come to find her ideas unfiltered by anyone except for Rand and Branden. And as I show in the book, this objectivist subculture became a very palpable presence, particularly on college campuses and particularly among student conservatives. And so objectivism really became a wing of the student conservative movement in the 1960s. Rand, in fact, came to the University of Virginia. And I have a letter from a student who said that seeing Rand speak at UVA was the first thing he'd, quote, gotten really excited about in 3 years of college. So Rand had this great impact in college campuses. She spoke her mind. She was very clear in her ideas. She sort of flew in the face of all the ethical and moral teachings students had ever heard. She really fit into the sort of rebellious spirit of the times very well. And as the Vietnam War emerged as a political issue, Rand became very important for her opposition to the draft, which she saw as a clear-cut violation of individual rights. So she attracted a whole host of students to her banner who found that a very attractive and consistent position, and again created a split between those who looked to Rand and those who looked to the more mature conservatives of National Review, who saw Vietnam as an important war worthy of their support. So there are many ironies in this story of Ayn Rand, but one of them is that the more popular she became, the more suspicious Rand got of her following. And she became very alarmed that people were not quite understanding her ideas or using them improperly, and there's this constant battle to try to exert control. She announced in her newsletter that people should not call themselves objectivists, but should call themselves students of objectivism, because no one could fully grasp the philosophy. Until it had been more fully elaborated and taught. Maybe in the future there could be objectivists. Until that point, she was an objectivist and Nathaniel Branden was an objectivist, but no, everybody else were students of objectivism. Now, so as part of this, she began to impose rules not only on what you could call yourself, but how you could use her material. So once again, to bring us back to the University of Virginia, I'll read a section here where the University of Virginia Ayn Rand Society, 1967, planned an ambitious 3-day conference with speakers, discussion groups, a banquet, and several cocktail parties. Eager to draw Rand's blessing and interested in her advice, the organizers shared their plans for an event intended to, quote, provide what neither our colleges or our culture provides, an exciting intellectual experience and a social event, end quote. What Rand noticed instead was that the club used a phrase from John Galt's oath on their stationery. Her letter dispatched a blistering letter ordering removal of the offensive quote. The club's president was apologetic and ashamed. Quote, I've cut the bottoms from all our stationery I have and have issued instructions, and anyone else who has any of our stationery shall do likewise. So this is part of a general distemper that began to mark and really define Rand's later years, and it's a hint of some of the personal harshness that marked her personality. And as I said, she had a temper throughout her life. It grew worse. And as you look to what's happening in her personal life, it gives you some clues as to why she became more and more angry, even as she became increasingly successful. I want to turn now to a question that may have been at the back of your mind. Who is this Nathaniel Branden character, and why was he so significant to her? What role did he play? So I want to read an excerpt now from the mid-50s that sort of catches their relationship at a key transition point. Although it started innocently enough, there had always been a current of flirtation between the two. Rand made no secret of her esteem for Nathan, openly identifying him as a genius. His face, she said, was her kind of face. The Brandens' marriage only briefly papered over the growing attraction between Ayn and Nathan. The subtext of their relationship spilled into the open during a long car ride to Canada in the fall of 1954. The two couples and another friend had taken a road trip to visit Barbara's family. On the way home, Barbara watched her husband and Rand holding hands and nuzzling in the back seat. Sick with jealousy and anger, she confronted him afterward. Nathan denied everything. He and Rand had a special friendship, nothing more. His sentiment was genuine. Nathan worshipped Rand, but it was Barbara he had chosen, or so he consciously believed. Like Barbara, Ayn had registered a shift. The next day, she summoned Nathan to her apartment, where she waited alone. It was a scene out of the best romantic fiction. After some delay, Rand became urgent and direct. She and Nathan had fallen in love, yes? Nathan, overwhelmed, flattered, excited, confused, responded in kind. They kissed hesitantly. There would be no turning back. But this was still the founder of objectivism, believing in rationality above all else. They must be honest with their spouses, Rand decided. She called them all to a meeting at her apartment. As Barbara and Frank listened incredulously, Rand's hypnotic voice filled the room and stilled their protests. The spell she had cast was too strong to break now. At meeting's end, she and Nathan had secured what they requested, a few hours alone each week. Their relationship would be strictly platonic, they assured their spouses. Privacy would enable them to explore the intellectual and emotional connection they could no longer pretend did not exist. When the inevitable happened, Rand was again honest with both Barbara and Frank. She and Nathan wished now to be lovers, she explained, but it would naturally be a short affair. She had no wish to hold back Nathan, 25 years her junior. Her explanation came clothed in the rational philosophy she had taught them all. By giving their feelings full expression, Nathan and Ayn were simply acknowledging the nature of reality. So, if you want to know what happens next, you'll have to read the book. And there are many twists and turns